The day began with heat that didn't shimmer so much as press, a hand over the mouth of a city that had learned to make do. Motorbikes braided the traffic like wire, vendors threaded between bumpers with trays and buckets, and at a red light shaped like a tired eye, a child with a blue basin of plastic sachets moved toward the driver's window of a dusty government pickup. Her wrists were thin. The ice had melted to marbles, clacking in the basin. The driver glanced back for permission. In the back seat, the leader, called Ibrahim by those who needed courage to speak at all, quietly nodded. He could read a city from the way people carried water. The sachet tore, the girl's hands were quick, and he drank the first swallow not for thirst, but for timing. It tasted of a long journey in a short bag, clean enough, sharp with chlorine, like a promise that kept too much to itself. She said her name was Awa, as if a name had to be small to survive the road. The light turned green, but the pickup didn't surge. Ahead, orange cones narrowed the flow into a single lane under a sign that read, Urban Water Authority, Temporary Control Point. In the heat, the word control felt heavier than water. 2 uniforms, 1 municipal, 1 police, waved vendors aside with a practiced gesture that looked like brushing flies. Awa's eyes slid that way. She had been warned about the cones. The cones meant someone would examine her tray, ask for a permit receipt she could not afford to carry, and take the tray if the receipt was wrong or crumpled, or from last quarter instead of this one. She breathed the way sparrows breathe, high and fast. Ava's mother had sent her at dawn, the basin balanced with coins tucked under its rim, a ledger of hope in metal circles. They needed 6,000 francs CFA to cover rent arrears, and the landlord already carried the keys like a judge carries a verdict. At the cones, a clipboard appeared, lines ruled like the bars of a small window. The officer tapped the line where a number should be. Awa said softly that she had paid last week at a kiosk near the market. The officer asked for the kiosk code. She didn't know. She had paid with coins, not codes. He reached for the tray with the same fingers that had tapped the paper. A gate swung inward without hinges. Ibrahim watched the tray tilt. He watched one sachet fall and split, a glittering wound that soaked the dust. The heat swallowed the spill. In the shadow of the pickup, the air felt like it was holding its breath to see what he would do. He did not raise his voice. He opened the door. The hinges spoke in their humble, honest way. He stood, the kind of standing that rearranges a room even if the room is a road. His aide, Yusuf, palmed his phone as if documentaries could be shot through text messages and notes. The uniform stiffened but did not move aside. The officer with the clipboard wore a badge with a clean pin where it bit his shirt. The pin gleamed like a small moon in daylight. He pointed to the cones. Rules, he said, as if rules were shelters that could exclude the rain. The city had other gates too. Hospital desks where bills had to precede stitches, school offices where registration needed the right stamp in the right box on the right day. But water on the street was the oldest gate of all. It was the gate you met at your first breath. Ibrahim knew that gates matter less when the keeper remembers the purpose of the road. He could feel the day choosing its direction. Behind him, horns began to speak in that language of impatience cities grant to machines. Awa stood with her toes on the line of shadow, holding a basin that had become a ledger, every sachet a numbered entry. He turned to her, not to the officer. How much for the whole basin? She spoke a number that included both cost and hope. He told Yusuf to pay her and keep the basin in the shade. The officer opened his mouth like a door. This is a control point, he said, not a market stall. Ibrahim stepped closer to see the ledger on the clipboard. The columns were straight, the handwriting neat, the kind of neatness that knows itself as armor. He touched the edge of the paper without taking it. Then he looked at the cones, each scuffed at its base where they had been kicked into place, each a little door that pretended to be a wall. He said, not loudly, "Move these aside so traffic can breathe." The officer hesitated. "Breathing is not part of the policy," he said, trying to make a joke out of a ladder. People around them listened the way people listen when they sense a hinge moment, when a small sound might open a chamber behind a hallway. The sun climbed. The smell of melted plastic grew sweet and sick. The cones did not yet move, but the air did. It carried rumor toward the market, toward the neighborhood councils, toward every house with a cracked bucket and a school uniform drying by the stove. A story had stepped into the road. It would not step aside. By noon, the city had red eyes. A voice note jittered through WhatsApp groups, a recording of a vendor in the next arrondissement, breathless and angry, telling how the control point had seized 10 trays by mid-morning and demanded fees that didn't match the posted rate. The message crackled with details only the street knows. The last 3 digits of a mobile money number, the color of a stamp, how a receipt from last quarter had been declared not digitized and therefore not real. Photos followed, not dramatic, but precise. A tray leaned against a wall in an office with a sign that said, "Objects held pending regularization." A ledger page with 2 errors of ink, the newer entries crowding the older like vines over a fence. Between frames, the city's temperature rose. Awa sat in the shade of a shuttered pharmacy with the empty basin beside her and the coins under the rim, counted twice, counted again. She had sold the whole basin to a man who said to keep it in the shade, then told her to go home. She hesitated because her feet were trained for return trips. The road told a child where to go, but home meant explaining that money had arrived like a miracle handed across traffic, and miracles had a way of asking for proof. A neighborhood woman with the effortless rank of an auntie approached and coaxed Awa to drink 1 sachet the man had handed back to her, free of charge, a small clear reprieve slipping into her throat. "Breath before billing," the auntie murmured, and then laughed at herself as if she'd copied a line from a sermon. At the Urban Water Authority's central office, the director considered the control points like pieces on a board. He had issued the directive to tighten informal distribution channels after a tense budget review where the authority's revenue appeared thinner than the city's thirst. He was a careful man who balanced multiple ledgers, some public, some personal, none overtly illegal in his own mind. He was also a survivor. He knew how to read winds. The rumor that the leader had interfered at a control point was a crosswind. He called the deputy, who said the cones would remain until compliance metrics improved. He liked the phrase compliance metrics. It made difficult things sound measurable, and measurable things sounded harmless. On another street, a municipal nurse named Miriam shook her head as a cluster of vendors crowding her clinic door asked for letters to show the control point. Letters that could say they were tested for typhoid and their water was from the approved borehole. The clinic had letters for vaccination and births and deaths, but not for this. She watched a boy cough after swallowing warm water meant to be cold, and she felt the kind of anger that rides in the same car as care. She messaged a friend who worked at the authority and asked what exactly the new rules were. The reply came like a machine had written it. Peri-urban distribution consolidation, public safety, authorized points of sale. None of these words tasted like relief. The leader's aide, Issouf, sketched the morning on a yellow pad as if the day were a case in a long trial. Cones, clipboard, neat columns. A child whose lungs knew the city's true rule. He called the leader's attention to a line in an older policy, Directive 17B, about obstruction control, originally meant for illegal construction, now being used for bodies moving with water. The policy had a paragraph about fines payable at a kiosk or via mobile money. It had a clause about temporary seizure of goods to ensure compliance that had migrated like a weed into other fields. The uses of a clause can be more dangerous than the clause. Calls from neighborhood councils began to arrive at the presidency switchboard, humble in tone, meticulous in complaint. They did not accuse. They asked, if the new rule was for health, why were clean trays being confiscated at noon when everyone was thirsty? If the new rule was for order, why did officers advise vendors to come to a back door at the authority after hours? A receipt sent by voice note, a crisp photo of a stamp that had been pressed so hard it bled. A mobile number whispered as if it were the combination to a locked water tap. The story of the road matured into a case file. In a small meeting room with a table polished slick by elbows and files, Ibrahim listened the way a builder listens to a wall. He asked for exactly 3 things: the list of active control points with names of officers assigned, the text of Directive 17B and any amendments, and the last 6 months of receipts gathered under temporary seizure regularization. He asked for a 4th thing that didn't fit on paper: to visit unannounced. The team shifted in their chairs at that word. Unannounced, like breath taken without permission, like walking through a door that someone else considered theirs. He put on a simple cap. He left through a side exit. Momentum followed him out, patient as the heat, steady as the hum of a city waiting for its throat to be cleared. The unannounced visit began without the fuss that eats time. The pickup nosed toward the market like a fish pushing upstream, slow and persistent. In the back sat 2 cardboard boxes that looked unimportant. Inside were laminated cards, with a sentence printed on both sides in bold, the kind of sentence a city could memorize without counting. Hydration first, serve, then sort. It was not poetry. It didn't need to be. The boxes also held flyers in 3 languages, and a QR code linked to a WhatsApp number, where complaints could be filed with voice notes and photos. No forms. No jargon, only the promise of a human reading on the other end within 2 hours. Beside the boxes lay a plastic sheet rolled tight, the beginning of a shade tent. At the market's edge, the cones stood like little sentries bored with their duty. The same officer with the clean pin managed his clipboard. He did not recognize the pickup because the city had taught him that power arrives with sirens, with outriders who part the road. Power rarely walked. Ibrahim got out and took off the cap because caps can be a wall. He stepped into the shade of the kiosk awning where confiscated trays leaned like testimonies. He didn't announce himself. He began to ask questions the way nurses count breaths, calm and regular. When did this start? Where do the receipts go? What happens if the vendor cannot pay? Miriam, the nurse, arrived because word moved faster than engines. She carried a cooler with vaccine ice packs and a thermos of cold water for anyone already dizzy. She didn't wait for authorization to set up the plastic sheet between a tree and a pole. Shade is its own authority. She greeted the officers with the decency that makes refusal shameful. The crowd breathed slightly easier, as if shade were a moral, not a temperature. The officer with the pin began to explain policy alignment, but stopped when Ibrahim asked to see a random stack of receipts. Random was the important word. It is the enemy of choreography. The officer hesitated long enough to make the truth visible, then produced a stack from a drawer with a key that wasn't quite hidden. The receipts told two stories. The first was legitimate: a fine, a vendor's name, a permit number, a stamp that matched the wall poster. The second whispered, identical handwriting on forms from different days, missing kiosk codes, amounts rounded up to the nearest 1,000 rather than listed as posted, and most quietly of all, a set of mobile money transfer slips clipped behind certain receipts. Numbers scissored out just so. The ledger carried meaning like a glass carries light. Ibrahim looked at the wall where the poster claimed that fines could be waived for minors. He asked if any had been waived. The officer's silence was the sound of a gate leaning on its hinge. Breath before billing, Ibrahim said, almost to himself, testing the heft of the phrase against the day's heat. He handed the officer one of the laminated cards. Hydration. First, serve, then sort. He explained in a tone that made the cones look smaller that from this moment, vendors offering potable water, in sachets or from approved dispensers, would not be obstructed at any checkpoint. Safety checks would occur at source and storage, not in the roadway. Confiscations were to cease for minors entirely. Fees, if any, would be regularized at kiosks with paper receipts and public ledger entries, not in drawers. He did not ask if this could be done. He asked where to post the first card so the son could read it too. Yusuf posted the card with tape and a thumb pressed hard into the wall's dust. He unrolled the plastic sheet another meter. He began to log names from the confiscated trays and what was returned to whom, taking photos against the same wall each time so that the record had a rhythm. Miriam moved among the vendors, checking hands for cuts, asking about headaches, pressing sachets into palms with a gentle bossiness that defeated shame. The officer with the pin made a call that sounded like an apology disguised as a status update. In 20 minutes, a senior from the authority arrived with a tie loosened, a man trained to glide. He began with phrases like public-private coordination and pilot program. Ibrahim held up a receipt with a number that had been rounded. Why this amount here? The senior's glide slowed. A community elder, Fatih, known for organizing funeral committees and football tournaments with the same efficiency, cleared her throat. She said the city's bones were good, but the tendons were tight. Let them stretch. She asked for a phone number she could share in her women's association group, a number that answered. Ibrahim gave the WhatsApp line and told her the rule they were imprinting. Serve first, sort later. She repeated it louder than necessary so that the cones could hear too. The cones had no ears, but they heard. Within the hour, trays that had leaned became trays that moved, and the roadway learned the feeling of a gate removed. Intervention is not magic. It is a door opened with the right hand. To ensure the change did not die with the heat of the day, Ibrahim left behind more than cards. He asked the officers to count out the cash collected that morning and place it on the desk atop the ledger. He pointed to each bill like a teacher calling attendance. He told the senior from the authority to send an auditor within 2 hours and asked Miriam to stay until the sun shifted and the shade moved. He promised to return with questions that would not fit on a poster. The road exhaled. That exhale became wind. The audit began where most truth starts, with small arithmetic that refuses to lie. In a quiet room at the Presidency Annex, far from horns and cones, a table hosted a parade of items that looked ordinary until they were placed side by side. 3 stacks of receipts from different control points. 4 mobile money statements printed from agents' devices, names partially whited out, the telltale ghost of numbers visible at an angle. A PDF of Directive 17B projected onto a wall, its clauses magnified until commas looked like pebbles. A WhatsApp thread from vendors that had swollen into a citizen newsroom, voice notes labeled with locations, timestamps, and snippets like, They told me to come after 6, and the kiosk said my code didn't exist. On a separate screen, a live dashboard took its first breath, a clumsy prototype built by a young civil servant who liked clear lines and dislikes excuses. The title bar read, Hydration First Metrics, and below it, 3 dials idled at 0, waiting for the city's day to fill them with meaning. The first dial would show door-to-drink minutes at checkpoints repurposed as support points. The second would tally detentions of trays in last 24 hours, aiming for a steep decline. The third would count complaints received and resolved, an honest pair. A fourth measure sat quietly. Officer discretion overrides, a number that spiked when bad habits tried to reclaim ground. Ibrahim didn't edit. He asked the young civil servant, name tag reading Adama, to keep the lines blunt and public. He wanted a display on a television at the lobby of the Urban Water Authority, another at the Market Council Hall, and another in the waiting room of a clinic like Miriam's. A city behaves differently when it can see itself. As the receipts were matched to mobile money slips and official ledgers, patterns emerged with the persistence of ants. The same agent number appeared repeatedly as a destination for regularization payments. The amounts often exceeded the posted fines by round increments, 1,000 by 1,000. A footnote in Directive 17B, rarely noticed, had been used to justify on-site processing assistance by officers. A door ajar enough for a hand to reach into pockets. None of this was an indictment of a grand conspiracy. It was worse. It was a garden of petty gates tended by people who thought necessity canceled ethics. It was someone teaching someone else that a drawer is safer than a ledger. The obstructive official had a name, of course, and it appeared neatly in appointment calendars and memos. The Director of Urban Distribution Compliance, a bureaucratic syllable stack that sounded impossible to corrupt because it sounded impossible to understand. He was called into a room where words could not hide. Ibrahim did not accuse. He asked him to read aloud the clause he had extended beyond its bone. The director's voice did not tremble. He had given this speech before. He invoked public safety and counterfeit water, non-compliant wholesalers, and the pressure to close revenue gaps. He spoke as if speaking could rewind a law. He landed on the word quotas and paused 1/2 second too long. Quotas, set by previous budgets, had pushed field units to meet numbers that had little to do with safety and much to do with a spreadsheet trying to please a minister in a different story. Perverse incentives don't announce themselves. They just show up everywhere their diet is served. The courageous insider stepped forward not with a flourish, but with documents that had the awkward earnestness of truth. Miriam provided a log from her clinic of cases of heat illness that had spiked in the weeks after control points began seizing trays near midday. Fadi offered a notebook where the Women's Association tracked petty payments to retrieve confiscated goods, with tallies of who had to borrow from whom to make it through. A junior officer, who had been told to shadow the clipboard man and learn how things are done, brought a copy of a text message from a supervisor. If they're minors, ask for an adult to come, but don't release the tray until payment. He had underlined the words until payment with the pressure of someone turning a pencil into an oath. Names were not broadcast. Positions were. Ibrahim insisted on a principle that would hold in court and in the market. Expose mechanisms, protect dignity, punish acts, not reputations. The report that went out that evening on public radio was spare and exact. A clause meant for construction had been misapplied to street vending. A quota system had turned safety into revenue. A set of processing assistance practices had sprouted in the shadow of ashy budgets. The Urban Water Authority had tolerated drawers alongside ledgers. A temporary stand-down of enforcement in the field was ordered pending reform. Listeners didn't need drama. They needed a door to open. On Telegram and WhatsApp, the Hydration First dashboard link appeared like a mirror held up in public. It was simple enough to screen record and share, a gesture that said there would be no backroom tonight. Adama added a tiny blinking dot next to the complaints resolve dial whenever the last case closed had involved a minor. It blinked twice before the evening news. 2 trays had been returned to children without charge. The city noticed the dot the way a parent notices a child's breath ease while sleeping. Ibrahim's aide texted a line to his boss. Naming broken things as a way of breathing for them. The leader wrote one reply, keep the door open. Reform in a heat-struck city needs to be as unromantic as shade. The first rule was named in words anyone could use, the first sip rule. Serve first, sort later. Every water vendor at an authorized source point or in transit to one would be assisted to serve during peak heat, and whatever paper followed would follow somewhere cooler. The second piece was surgical. The compliance quotas that had turned officers into debt collectors were abolished, replaced by a block grant from the finance ministry. tied not to fines collected, but to 3 public metrics. The same dials now visible in lobbies and halls. Door-to-drink minutes would have to fall. Detentions would have to trend down to near zero for minors and stay low for others. Complaint resolution would have to meet a simple service-level agreement, acknowledged within 2 hours, resolved within 24, with a reason written in words that would stand next to a mother in a market and not blush. At the control points, the cones were stacked neatly and redeployed as protectors around shade tents. The officers, who knew how to stand in heat for hours, learned to hold a different kind of line. They carried small thermometers and test strips for spot-checking water safety, useful as lectures are brief, decisive as badges can be when worn for care. A training drill began to circulate that embarrassed nobody and bored the proud in the right way. 3 questions, always in order. Is the child safe? Is the water clean? Is there shade? If any answer was no, you fixed that first. Only then did the ledger appear. Officers signed a humble oath on a 1-page sheet, left thumbprint beside signature, because ink remembers. The Urban Water Authority reauthored its own door. The drawers were emptied into ledgers, and the ledgers were photographed and uploaded daily to a public board with dates like nails. The old clause was narrowed to its bone, sewed in the soil where it belonged. A new clause, Hydration First Protocol, took root with a single sentence. No enforcement action may obstruct access to potable water for the public during designated heat hours. Administrative processing shall not precede service. Its elegance lay in its refusal to perform. It simply drew breath. A complaints channel with a short USSD code and a WhatsApp line was publicized on radio jingles and the backs of buses. Voice notes were welcome, any language acceptable, photos optional, anonymity permitted. A small office in a side hall, staffed by a dama and 2 clerks with sharp pencils and softer eyes, listened like it was medicine. Each complaint received a number and a callback. The board over their heads ticked both up and down in honest choreography. The clerks learned the city's lexicon for corner names and kiosk nicknames, and the board's lines began to sink where they should and rise where they must. Funding shifted the way riverbeds shift under rain. Officers' field allowances were decoupled from fines and coupled instead to adherence to the rule. Stipends awarded when door-to-drink minutes dropped below a threshold in their area, and deducted when trays were detained without cause, not punishment so much as gravity. The perverse incentive lost calories. In the first 2 weeks, there were missteps. Old habits knocked like relatives. A supervisor tried to hide confiscated trays in a storeroom behind a door labeled materials. Fatih arrived with 2 aunties and a phone camera and a gentle smile that makes lying feel like a sin. The trays came out. A few people were suspended, 1 prosecuted for extorting minors. The public statement named the act, not the man. Dignity for the individual, ruthlessness for the mechanism. Miriam's clinic received 2 coolers and a small budget line for street hydration support. She trained volunteers to recognize the first signs of heat distress without turning it into a ceremony. The Market Council, half of whom had never seen a dashboard, began to read the dials as if weather planning shaded rest pockets near busy crossings where bodies could pause without being shooed. School principals were asked to adjust dismissal times by 30 minutes on red flag days, and their compliance found a corner on the board. Schools aligned. The city's rhythm changed by seconds, which is how cities survive. Every Friday, Ibrahim sat for an hour in a small room with a whiteboard that had no grand strategy drawn on it. Only last week's numbers, a photo or 2 from vendors, and notes from site visits. Cone turned into stool. Officer gave shade to elder. Kiosk ran out of receipt paper at 2 p.m. He asked for 3 stories, 1 of adherence, 1 of failure, 1 of surprise. That ritual gave the reform its breath. No speeches, no banners, just a door you could exit and find water on the other side, and a ledger that matched the road without making it bow. The city did not become a poem. It became a schedule you could believe. By the next season, market mornings had a thicker shade. Not by miracle, but by a line in a budget and a meeting where someone insisted that cloth could be procured locally. The cones, those board sentries, found their best selves guarding school crosswalks. The hydration, first board at the authority, became a piece of furniture the janitor dusted without noticing, the way a family forgets to admire the table that feeds them. The dials moved within bands that the public learned by eye. Door-to-drink settled at single digits during peak heat. Trade detentions for minors read zeros for days in a row. Complaints came in like rain and were answered like roofs do, reliably, without applause. Awa's basin, once a ledger, became a memory. Her mother took a stall in the market's new hydration corridor. A row of shaded kiosks with water inspected at source and storage. receipts printed that didn't smudge, and a pinned card at each corner. Serve first, sort later. The stall earned enough to retire the landlord's key from its role as threat. Awa, in a blue school uniform, traced fractions in chalk, her mind leading the number into daylight. Sometimes she still carried water on weekends, because the road had taught her balance. The difference was the way adults treated her balance now, not as a permission for taking, but as a testimony they protected. Miriam found the boredom she had prayed for. Heat illness visits dropped on the chart pinned near the vaccine fridge. The training drill became a reflex. Is the child safe? Is the water clean? Is there shade? New volunteers said the questions before she asked them. She still kept a cooler and a thermos by the door because habit is just love that survived Tuesday. Fatih's Women's Association shifted from retrieving trays to checking receipts for accuracy and teaching young vendors how to use the USSD code. They made games of it, and children laughed while learning the number that could argue on their behalf. At the Urban Water Authority, the Director of Urban Distribution Compliance was no longer called that. The office was renamed Safe, Hydration, and Street Support. The new director, a woman with calluses from organizing borehole schedules in her neighborhood, kept the drawer handles unscrewed as a joke that nobody found funny anymore. The board in the lobby stayed on even during power cuts, running on a small backup that the janitors swore and protected. People passed it and glanced, the way citizens check the weather without ceremony, and felt the city's breath in their own lungs. Ibrahim visited the market less often. Interventions that require a leader every morning are not interventions. They are performances. He walked sometimes at dusk when the heat gave back a few degrees, and the fried plantain oil smelled like home. He bought a sachet from a boy who wasn't afraid of the cones, because the cones had been redeployed into safety. He watched the boy tear plastic with clean hands. He paid the posted price and received a receipt he did not need, smiled at a sign that said hydration first, with a corner peeling from the wall like a leaf starting to curl, which is what honest things do when they live in weather. He passed a radio where a caller recited last week's numbers as if reading a grocery list, bored and pleased. If justice is a drama, its best final act is daily life performed without fear. On a Monday, the dashboard added a modest new line, not in bright color, but in a tone you notice only when it's missing. Copycat gates converted. It counted how many other departments had repurposed their own cones and drawers. School registration queues that now serve food to waiting children before demanding forms. Clinic billing desks that adopted a treat-first sign with a handwriting similar to Adama's typography. A municipal registry that placed chairs under trees for elders, then built a shade canopy where the chairs proved the need. Culture is when rules stop needing microphones. The city's door stayed open most days. On the days it swung shut, habit pushed it back. A complaint blinked on a screen. A clerk answered by noon. A nurse paused at a stall and asked if the water was clean. An officer asked his 3 questions. A leader breathed and did not need to be seen. The ledger and the road learned to speak the same language. 1 column for time, 1 for breath. And in the corner of a market, where a basin had once been a sentence passed down to a child, a girl now solved for X, as if life had always contained unknowns that surrendered, eventually, to careful hands. As the city exhales and the ledger finally agrees with the road, we leave you with one simple rule. Serve first, sort later, and a hope that such small doors stay open everywhere. If this story moved you, carried you, or even just made you pause, stay with us as we keep tracing the quiet victories that turn policy into habit. And if you liked the video, then like, share, comment, and subscribe.